Hello, my name's Simon Gibbon, and this is a repeat of the talk I gave to the Joint Council's Crustacean Working Party on the 1st of September 2023. It's not a verbatim report, as I didn't take exact notes and I wasn't working from a script, but hopefully it'll be true to what I said to them. I haven't added anything else I've learned since, but I will give a few more references and acknowledgements to people who have also been involved. Why should you listen to me? Well, Simon Gibbon, as I say, I've been an industrial chemist for the past 40 years, and hence involved in formulated products and things that end up in water. So I was concerned when I heard about the die-off of crabs on the northeast coast in October 2022. The first time I got actively involved was in August 2020. Sorry, that was 2021. First time I got actively involved was in August 2022 when I was asked to help fly a drone over one of the celebrations protests in Saltburn. And when I turned up to fly a drone, I found there were lots of far better drone flyers than me. So having not flown my drone too much, I then looked into what had gone on. And one of the first things that struck me was the mention of the South Tees site. And at that stage, a compulsory purchase order had happened for it. And I looked back through that and it pointed out how contaminated the site was. And then I looked at the master plan for the regeneration of that site, pointed out how contaminated the site was. And then I started to look through the planning applications, and I was very surprised to find that the planning applications, while mentioning a lot of contamination, seemed not to have any worries about any environmental receptors of that contamination, because they said that there was no pathway to get there. So this is what I'll tell you about now, is my view of how this has happened. And to get to this point, I've been helped by Rob and Dawn, who are mentioned here, and have more of a practical experience in what it's like to actually work on a development site and to understand the environmental. I'm coming at this as a chemist who understands some of the fundamental science behind how chemistry works, but I don't understand the practicalities of developing a site. And so on some occasions, my view may be rather naive, but I think it still raises a lot of questions, and perhaps questions that people who are involved in this on a day-to-day basis may not come back to, or they may accept the answers from people who tell them that it's all right. So anyway, I will start at this point. I just want to acknowledge that a lot of people have helped me who've been involved. Rachel Randall has been directly involved in helping us understand this. Sally Bunce has been very active with the Reclaim RC Facebook group and generally finding out about these issues, tying together the people who are environmentally concerned, fishers concerned. A lot of the fishermen, Joe Stan, Rennie, Joe Redfern, Sarah Rennie, and the Northeast Fishing Collective have been inspiration for what I've been doing and pointed to things I should look into. John Irwin has helped me around some of the planning. I mean, once again, I'm no expert on planning, but I'm starting to just understand more about it. A lot of people on Twitter have pointed me in the right direction, given me inspiration. And then all the press that's been happening with this, from Private Eye to Yorkshire Post to Times, the Financial Times, The Guardian, have all pointed in directions and asked questions that I think need answering. It looks like some of the corruption questions are being asked, but I'm concerned that the environmental questions may then get neglected in all the worry about what's happened about the other process going on. And I also want to mention Paul Cawthorne, who's been very useful in pointing out other areas of the country where things are going on. So at that point, I'll make a start on the talk proper. Really, just to give you a sort of summary in a way to start with, or a high-level view, taking into account the size of the site, history of contaminating industrial usage, and inventory of hazardous chemicals known to be present. We know the site contains a large amount of chemicals highly toxic to marine life. The ground is still contaminated. The level of hydrocarbons from coke operations, from oil operations that happened on that site. We don't know the exact source of them often because the history isn't complete, and it doesn't necessarily say that the contamination is where that industry was happening. It's where it's flowed to. One has to make an assumption that this site, and I mean, I feel the assumption should be made that the site is likely to cause environmental damage, or at least reduce resilience to the local environment to damage with any development happening on it. So you have to carry out all operations with that assumption now and going forward. And taking that in mind, the process just looks too cheap and too quick. Now, it's a huge site, so sums of money are huge, but if you divide that by the number of hectares, number of acres involved, the site per hectare or acre looks just too cheap. And these processes aren't necessarily quick. I mean, to actually treat this amount of contamination would take an awful lot of time. Or it takes major engineering operations to make sure that contamination stays localized. And neither of those can I see happening. So, I mean, I have some recommendations. This was aimed at the councillors who I was talking to. And basically, I think that the environmental risk assessment should be reassessed and based on cumulative, not individual risks. An awful lot of risk assessments, you look at one particular risk and you say, is it above some sort of threshold? No, it's not. Fine. The trouble with this site is it's huge, and there are so many different risks of so many different types of chemicals and in so many different places that individually they may not pose a risk, but cumulatively they pose a huge risk. So, for example, removing 2 million tons of sediment from the River Tees where it was, if you calculate the amount of oil in that sediment, it's 200 tons, but any 1 ton of sediment being removed, there's not much oil. But cumulatively, we've dumped 200 tons of oil out at sea. Would you have allowed that to happen? And I think some of those questions, the systems, regulatory systems aren't in place and the processes aren't to ask the questions properly. So I'd request that DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and its sister, well, the agencies which it sponsors, the Environment Agency and the Centre for CFAS anyway, should carry out an audit of contamination within and entering the River Tees. The River Tees has a huge industrial history, and that needs looking at. And the latest, potential area that's going to change that is the South Tees site, which we'll talk about now. The Marine Management Organisation, who licensed the dumping of material at seas, knows the cumulative amount of material that has been disposed of to the sites off the River Tees. That needs to be known and publicised. And then this data could be used to request the appropriate level of funding to protect the environment. So what are the chemical risks? Before remediation happened, the site as left had a lot of above ground risks. There were chemicals left, residues of largely of the coking process, so coal tar byproducts. Thousands of tons of material were left, coal tar extracts, ammoniacal liquids, and these presented real fire and explosion risks. And that was the reaction side, but just their presence required that they needed protection. And that's why the site was determined to be a coma site. So this is control of major accident hazards. So there had to be plans for what happened when things went wrong, and it was inspected regularly. And things like you couldn't build a building more than 3 stories high, you couldn't have more than 100 people in a building because of the level of the risks. Now, below ground, which isn't considered within that sort of coma status, there's greater than 100 years of coke production. And coke production basically is the heating of coal. In the process of that, you drive off coal tar, you effectively distill off a lot of nasty chemicals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that will end up with the best will in the world in the ground. And those are going to be contaminating the sites. And this is why if you go around the country, you will find lots of coal tar, lots of coal tar works, lots of gas works, coke works that have taken tens of years to remediate because they've tried once to clean up the ground and then they found the contaminants has reoccurred. So they've had to go in and do it more seriously. And of course, bear in mind there were thousands of tons of material above the ground. My concern is also that as demolition happened before contamination, some of those have been released into the ground. And we know what those were, and we know they were dangerous. So when you think about risk assessing, you basically look at a source, a pathway, and a receptor. So for example, in this conceptual model for an EPA diagram source here, basically says your source as being these drums underneath this kid swimming in a pool, and they're leaching into the ground. Now that can result in material traveling away from there, and it's fine there, it's not hurting anything possibly, but as soon as it starts to travel through the ground here and ends up into this aquatic habitat, then you have your pathway, because in that aquatic habitat will be fish, for example. If the chemical is poisonous to fish, you now have a way of poisoning those fish. And an even simpler example is, for example, asbestos sat on the ground. There's any wind around, there are humans, you have a pathway for that to cause cancer in humans. Now you can remove that, and this is what is mitigation, as it's called, by capping with soil. So you put clean soil on top of there, you've suppressed any ability of the asbestos to escape, and as long as nobody digs up that soil, that is safe. It doesn't mean to say the ground's uncontaminated, but it's now safe. So for anything, you build up these sort of site conceptual models, and this is, sorry, conceptual site models, and this is what's shown here. You have a house, people living in it, potential for indirect exposure. You have material coming down here. They take their water out the ground underneath it. So you consider all of these points, and you either you rule out the fact they will cause any problems, or you put measures in place to stop them. So, for example, one measure could be you stop abstracting water from here. That hasn't cleaned up at all, but it has removed the problem from people. Now, when we think about the River Tees, where the South Tees site is, it is right by the River Tees. So you have a far more complicated situation. Material can be traveling into the river. And we'll talk about NAPLs later, but you can have material trapped within sediments that from dredging will be exposed. You can have material traveling into the river, and all these will create challenges for the environment. Now, many of these have been addressed within the planning applications, but normally the conclusion has been made that these are insignificant risks. The pathways are insignificant, so you don't have to do anything to mitigate the actual source of the contamination. And I'm not convinced that that is not one of the causes why we have seen issues with die-offs around the Tees. So if we come right back to start with this stage, one of the early planning applications in 2019, basically for the whole site, was R 2019-0427 FFM. So this is an outline planning application, and the Environment Agency has responsible for certain parts of any development, but it isn't responsible for lots of others. The local planning authority is responsible. So it puts specific recommendations in. When asked about a planning application, it responds with specific specific requirements that it requires to, well, specific conditions that it requires should be completed prior to anything happening. However, there are other areas where it is the body that writes the policies that then the local authorities implement. And it's this area where I think the Environment Agency made a very key statement that wasn't incorporated into any subsequent planning requirements or restrictions. And that was these decontaminations should be completed prior to any demolition or longer term restoration. Now, in fact, just a couple of months ago, the South Teesworks, who have taken over, who are now the company running the South Tees site, announced that all demolition operations had now been completed. However, the site is still under the coma status, so it is considered still to be a site of major accident hazard for humans. So this hasn't been how things have been done. Now, you can decontaminate at the same time as demolition, but you have to do it with people who understand all the risks. I believe that if you are demolishing first, there is a real danger that the decontamination aspect will not have been properly considered, because this site had really dangerous chemicals that could then also end up, when they're in the ground, continue to create a hazard. So you've got the hazard of actually operating with it, plus you've got the hazard of long-term issues. And if you're demolishing while there is still contamination there, there is a real risk that this contamination will persist on the site when it shouldn't. And to many reasons, I feel this is where things sort of went wrong. If the operations had been carried out in the opposite way, and it would have slowed the process down, no question. The whole site should have been properly decontaminated before demolition started. And I'll come back to why this is the case. So basically, back in 2019, this is the situation we had. The South Tees, we have the River Tees here. We have what's called the South Tees site here. And the areas in red are the areas where basically the residual parts of what had been SSI and previous steel making operations happening on the site. The particular one we'll talk about quite a lot is South Bank. This is this area here. where the SEAH monopile factory is now being built. And within this, you have the South Bank coke ovens. So the coke ovens were here, and there was the Dorman Long Tower just about there where the pointer is. And this is a highly contaminated area because there has been 54 coke ovens operating until 2015, all of which were producing coal tar. That material was then processed here to make products such as pyridine, but other materials that were byproducts of the coal tar, coal tar and coke production. And then here you have the blast furnace and so on, and we'll come back to some of these. So even back, so these are pages taken from the South Tees Development Corporation's South Tees Regeneration Master Plan, the second version that was published in 2019 after consultation. And it once again shows major hazards at upper zones. Now, these are areas where for different reasons there are major hazards of operating. And this is why I feel that, carrying out demolition with so much material, even if you're working here, you are right near to areas that are potentially dangerous and pose major hazards. So this is what the site looks like. And I think I'd point you to a few things. So there is, it is a site with relatively few structures remaining on it. But as you can see here, there are areas that are black. Well, that's black because it's been used in coal operations for a long period of time. There was coal tar there. There will be coal tar under the ground. And if there isn't, it's the only site in the country where coke production has happened that there isn't that level of contamination. If you look at the other end of the site, so now we're looking at the blast furnace. There's the blast furnace, and once again you can see where bulk coal handling operations have been happening, and also there are coke oven in amongst here, where once again there will be coal tar residues left. So this is where the net zero Teesside operations will happen, and will involve once again major excavation of the ground. What was actually, so I've talked about coma, and basically these are the areas. The red is where the very dangerous was, and then blue is where there are different sets of rules. So in this red area, there were very large restrictions onto what could actually be done there. Now, it didn't stop decontamination, but it did stop any ongoing operations in terms of if you wanted to build buildings of a certain site, and if you hadn't got rid of that coma status. So that coma status is being removed, and I mean, a lot of the work has been done. So this red line here, for example, is the coke oven gas main. So that was a pipe that varied in size from, I think, 2.5 meters to only fractions of a meter. But in this bit here, it is the big pipe. It's passing gas between the different areas because you were generating gas as part of these coke operations, and that was used within the steel making process. But within that, you then have condensation of coal tar. So at the bottom of these pipes was left pyrophoric material that would catch fire if exposed to oxygen. So that had to be handled very carefully. And a big contract was recently completed to clean this and remove all that material. So we can assume that all the material has now been removed. But before that happened, and yeah, I suppose the other thing just to say here is that not only have you got what's above ground hazards there, and a lot of these are put relatively far away from the river. So the river is here, and there was a statement made from one of the questions that was put to the government, as in, were the hazards created by demolition considered as part of the various inquiries into the crab death die-off? And the answer was yes, they were considered not to be significant because they were more than 20 meters. Any operations happened were more than 20 meters away from the river. The ones operations happened around the time of October 2021 when there was the crab die-off. In fact, the site is covered in watercourses, and there will be drains and pipes and so on across here, all of which basically mean there is a way for contamination from here. As you can see, the coke main here, for example, runs along this watercourse. Those all run into the Tees. Sometimes they're exposed, as in here, sometimes they're in a culvert. And there are a lot of watercourses, and this has been well covered by Tees Valley Monitor, by Northeast Bylines, and stories they've presented about the various different risks on the site. But not only that, you've then got pipes and things like this, which are in the thing. And the trouble of a pipe is you've dug the ground up. That ground will be a preferential pathway. So any of these areas here, if you put contamination here, there is likely to be flow of it, around the outside of the pipe, even if the pipe isn't broken and it's flowing through the pipe. So all of these present risks that if you haven't dealt with them first, and then you start to demolish things, will start to create issues. Once again, from the generation, what is some of the other major facilities that are there? So there are utilities corridors, once again, with multiple pipes running through them and disruptions to the ground, potentially producing a pathway through which contamination could travel to the river. So why am I concerned prior to October 2021? Well, prior to October 2021, there were heavy oil tanks that were removed here. That was earlier that year. And they certainly present risks both in what was inside them and potentially what was in the ground underneath them, having been used to store oil for many years. There was piling work going on in what is now the SEH and South Bank Quay area. And that is disrupting the ground, potentially giving us a pathway, as shown in the sort of the conceptual site model, for material to travel out of this ground into the river. And then in September 2021, there were two big explosions one night to bring down the, well, probably more than two, but there were two locations of explosions. One was the Dorman Long tower, and the other one was some of the gantries and conveyor belts that supported that coke operation that were both flown up at night. Now, as you can see, these are right near to where the hazards for the South Bank coke oven, byproducts plant was. They're right near to the coke main. Did these in themselves cause cracks in the ground, cracks in structures that were falling, that then resulted in material traveling into drains? I think bearing in mind the coma actually states aquatic risk, you have explosions and then you have things dying off. There is a certain simplistic view that says that could well be what's involved, have been one of the causes. It's very difficult behind to find all the information, and I'll refer to people like Gary Caldwell, who's going into this, has managed to show that pyridine, for example, one of the byproducts of coking operations, is toxic to crabs, and was found in high concentrations in crabs that had died. Now, there are other sources of pyridine, so this may not be the source, but this is certainly one risk that was there. If we put that in the process of what the site itself has said in areas, as you can see, you are having explosions on what areas of major hazards. It really feels to me you don't do that. It's like going out at night. Going out at night on an icy night. You don't go out without clearing your windscreen first. That makes it a lot safer for you to drive. Even if the road's skiddy, at least you can see. But this way, you don't clear your windscreen. In this case, we didn't clean up what was inside, all the coal tarts hanging around. It looks like an accident to happen, and bearing in mind the die-offs in October 2021, was it an accident that happened? In the planning applications, there are fantastic details, and the links are down here. I'll supply those as well. There are fantastic details of all the industry that's gone on. And as you can see from 1893, this map shows there were certain industries happened. 1938, they changed, 1955. So this has all changed over time. And the other thing is that all this ground is reclaimed. All of this used to be tidal marsh, salt flat, until it was built up. A lot of it was built up with slag. So you have a very porous ground. And as I'm saying, there's considerable inventory of hazardous chemicals on the site. There's complex contaminated remaining structures, both. They're both above ground and below ground. The South Bank Oven Coke Works had extensive cellars underneath it. All of these present routes by which contamination is in the ground and could be moved from the ground when you remove these structures. Long history of industrial use, and from coke ovens, from gas works, from coal tar plants, you just should expect there to be hazards there. You don't have to look for them. You should just expect them and act accordingly. And because of the complexity of the site, there are multiple known, the actual river itself, the waterways going through the site. There are unknown pathways, pipes that have been forgotten about, pipes that are there but are cracked or have paths going down beside them that could allow material to contaminate the river and the sea. this isn't the only site. There are many sites have been contaminated, and they've been cleaned up. And this is really important. We need to clean up brownfield sites, but we need to do it properly. Teesworks, well, South Tees site is, I think, 2,500 hectares. There was a 98 hectare site called the Avenue Coatworks in Chesterfield. Now, this was cleaned up to become nature and housing, so the level of cleanliness was obviously higher than was needed necessarily for the use of South Tees. However, bearing in mind this was also next to a river, a small river, but a clear river, whereas the South Tees is right next to a large river, a very turbid river, a river we can't see what's going on underneath it. But to remediate that site took basically 200 million, or at least 100 million in just the remediation itself. It took 10 years to do it. They tried once, and the method they tried first didn't get the land clean. So in the end, they basically cooked 2 million tons of soil. Now, that's not the greatest thing to do. It uses large amounts of energy, but to do it by things like bioremediation, they could have thought of, or continuous pumping, would have been a slower process. So one other site that is nearer to us is the St Anthony's Tar Works up in Newcastle. That's had 3 attempts. The final attempt has actually put an impermeable barrier around the site. So it's totally broken that pathway because material that's contaminated on the site can't flow out of it. The ground underneath the site is not totally clean, but it can't do any damage because it's trapped within there. And the site is permanently monitored to make sure that that's not occurring. And then bioremediation, you can get bacteria to do some of the breakup of these chemicals. They don't last forever if they're destroyed by bacteria, but the projects take 10 years. You don't do it in 2 years. If you go up to Newcastle, you can see the St Anthony's tar work. There's a nice sign giving the history of it. And it's fascinating seeing, what's been there at one stage, what's there now, and how these were brownfield sites that were, in the end, and it was a painful process, I think if you talk the residents around there, brought back to being something that could be used and safe for both humans and for the environment. Now, the real hazard with South Tees, I feel, is probably the coatworks and why I've been mentioning them regularly. What are called non-aqueous phase liquids. And I'll use this term because it's not one I'd come across before I started reading about environmental contamination, the remediation of that. To me, they're just non-aqueous. Well, they're non-aqueous. They're liquids like oil and water. Oil doesn't mix with water. So anything that's an organic compound, a hydrocarbon, a chlorocarbon, or coal tar, are non-aqueous phase liquids in this context. So if they go into the water, they go into the ground, they go into water, they won't mix perfectly with the water there. They'll stay separate. Now, coal tar is a specific one that we're interested in here. They have different solubilities because coal tar is not a single component. It's made up of thousands of different hydrocarbon chemicals. Because you imagine heating coke to a very high temperature drives off lots of things, but it also causes some reactions to happen. So coal tar is a very complex mixture, and that's what we're dealing with here. And I think the solubilities, keep that in mind. There will be different solubilities of materials here, and that's one of the challenges. So this material falls into the ground, and we don't mind, it's in the ground, it's just sat there, not doing any problems possibly. But no, it will get travelled in because it will travel for 2 different reasons. It'll sink due to the density difference, so it's going to start to fall through the ground, and hence you see it seeping into the ground. It's heavier than water, so some of them could be heavier than water or lighter than water. They'll sink into the ground, and they'll be carried to a lesser or greater extent by the direction the water's flowing in. Now, within that, they're complex mixtures. Some materials will dissolve more than others, and those will be solubilized into the groundwater. And that's what you can measure away from the site. What's specifically nasty about coal tar is it's what's called a dense non-aqueous phase liquid. So it's denser than water. So it potentially will, as these pictures on the right here show, we have our dense NaPl has ended up in the bottom of here. So it's fallen through these granules. Whereas with a light non-aqueous phase liquid, it's largely just floating on top of the water here, and some's come down and got trapped in this structure. South Bank historic uses coking ovens, but there's also been heavy fuel oil storage there, and both of those will have resulted in heavy materials that are heavier than water potentially being in the system. So, okay, remember the weight and the fact they're heavier than water, and they'll start to separate out a bit. They're complex as well because they can be trapped. So if you think this is falling through the water, they have potentially will get trapped between grains of material and just held in the ground. So they aren't particularly soluble. They're sitting there for a period of time and they're just getting trapped in there. But as soon as you shake this ground, for example, with an explosion, the capillary forces that are holding this material here will change, and you can end up with your dense non-aqueous phase liquid now starting to come out and being able to travel again. So that could free your DNAPL and have us with coal tar moving towards the water. There are also mixtures, as we talked about. So, for example, here you can see a mixture of toluene and chloromethane and various other hydrocarbons. Now, if you're looking at the total concentration, you can see over time this drops. And chloromethane drops very rapidly because that's far more soluble, or relatively more soluble than toluene. But toluene concentration, if you measured it here, and let's say your limit was just above that point, so let's say your limit was 200, oh, fine, toluene's not a problem. But if you measure it at 800 days, you've now got 500, 500 milligrams per litre of toluene, which is way above your safe limit. So it's not easy to tell what your future hazards are going to be by measuring at one spot. Now, this was such a challenge that in 2003, the Environment Agency got a group of people together at ICI in the northwest of England to discuss how you should actually remediate sites, because ICI, amongst other companies, was creating such materials. In their case, it was largely chlorocarbons, but also there were people in the steel industry who were making coke and were aware that coal tar was equally creating these contaminating materials. So over time, and we're looking at long periods of time here, 1,000 days is 3 years. So even in 3 years, the material, and it's plateauing, it's not dropping off. So these materials present a long-term hazard as well. What's also problematic is we said they're dense, so they sink. So these are abstracts from the illustrated handbook of DNAPL transport and fate in the subsurface that this meeting in 2003 put together to explain to people what was going on. Now, this isn't a good example of South Tees, but you can see basically, if you've got Cretaceous chalk underneath here, DNAPL travels through the normal soil and then ends up going through cracks in the chalk and is traveling long distances away from where. So if you then come and try and abstract water from, for example, here, you will start to go into layers where the DNAPL is there. And another example of a different type, but here I just want to show you, we've got a river here, and this material, because of its density, is driven into here, but it's still coming up here because the pressure of material behind it is driving it up through here. So you're ending up a river that's way away from where your source of contamination is here, and it's ending up being contaminated. Now, the Tees is obviously very close to South Bank, the South Tees site and South Bank coke ovens, for example. Here's some practical examples of when this happened. So here you can actually see, let's look at these pictures first. So these examples are bricks here in the bottom of a small river. And you can see the bricks are that size, but the coal tar lump that we've got on the bottom of the river that's come out somewhere, and you can't see coal tar all around, it's localized. So if I look over here, I'll say it's clean, but if I look there, I'll say it's dirty. And this is why I was saying you really have to consider what's already on the site, what you know about the site, to say you expect that contamination. Just because I don't measure it now doesn't, to my mind, mean you can then say I don't have to worry about it. You absolutely can't, because you know it's there because what's been going on before. So we can see hydrocarbon staining here. And once again, with the River Tees, you see hydrocarbon staining on the top of it. But there are so many boat operations that it's not possible to say that's due to this one source. So nobody's looking for it, so nobody's finding it. The Tees is very turbid. So even if there are layers of coal tar sitting on the bottom of the river, they won't be seen. Plus, with the amount of sediment, this material would actually sink lightly through the sediment and end up underneath the sediment. And then, specific points here where you can see this coal tar is actually emerging in this particular example. So what do you do about NAPLs? I presented a really horrible picture of how horrible these are. Well, basically, you either remove it all. So you can do it quickly by basically digging all the soil out of the ground, heating it to high temperatures, and that would be a very expensive, very CO2 producing operation, and may not be appropriate for South Tees. You can carry out slow operations, so you either do bioremediation, you introduce bacteria, you get them into the ground, you put water through it, you monitor and so on. Or you perhaps, as they're doing, I think in a site in Sunderland where they have a solar system that works well, whenever the sun's out, it basically heats water, pushes it into the ground, takes it out, and that heat helps to dissolve material that's there, cleans up the water, pushes it down again. And that's running for multiple years or many years to clean up until that ground is clean. Or, the quick process you can do is entomb it. So if you can put a barrier between it and any possible receptors, things that are going to be poisoned by the chemicals coming out of it, then that's okay. So on one hand, that's what SAFTs are doing. They are putting a capping on the surface, but they're not making any kind of underground wall between where the likely coal tar sources are and where there's clean ground and clean water. So I think even some of the sites that have currently been cleaned up to a certain level will be being recontaminated over time. And that's a shame. And I think that, this presence of DNAPLs has been noted in some of the reports, but none of these remediation operations that are as extreme as I'm suggesting here, as in cooking all the ground or entombing it, has been mentioned. Instead, ground's been cleaned when it's found. And we'll come back to why, I don't think that's the right thing to do. You have to proactively look for it, not just find it and clean it. So South Bank, just the source of coal tar, you have a huge great gas tank here that's all this has now been leveled and it's been demolished by a mixture of in case of this was blown, the gas holder was blown up, the Dorman Long here was blown up. But here you had in 2021, there were basically 1,000 tons of coal tar related material was sat there. Now, bear in mind the explosion happened that year. At that time, there was 1,000 tons of material there waiting to escape if anything was cracked or broken. So I think there's something to be said. There was a big risk taken by just doing the explosions here. And the fact the deaths then happened the following month, is that related? I can't prove it is, but it does worry me. And if I'd been doing this, I might feel my gamble hadn't paid off. And if you look around the whole site, then there are multiple diagrams such as this one from the planning applications that explain where different contaminants were found. And once again, I showed you those pictures of the river where you had spots of coal tar being present. For what I don't know, but there could be a spot of coal tar here, which wasn't somewhere where they examined. They examined over here and found a small level of contamination. Fine, we won't worry about that. But actually, there was a reservoir of coal tar there, and I'll show you a picture in a second that highlights that. So I think, on this particular site, the South Bank, so we're now building the SEAH monopower factory here. There are non-aqueous insoluble materials present in water across the South Bank, as these shows. The DNAPL on site from historic uses. There was the material that was left in the South Bank coke ovens, and then there was the fuel tanks, which are down the river here, that were also demolished. So all of these were sources of contaminants that I think would have required a real impermeable barrier to be put up between them as sources of contamination and the vulnerable zones. The full set of explosions that happened are here. The work that's gone on, this has been demolished. Piling here, the oil tanks there, and as you can see, the black areas here that are largely coal residue, but will also have coal tar residue underground from the coking operations that have happened on this general site. I mean, this is the most latest coke ovens which is there, but there have been other sites of coke ovens in this area over the last 100 years. When we look at Redcar, then there are a lot more explosions happened here. Sorry, where the blast furnace was, so a lot more explosions happened here. But once again, there are major hazards here from the coke ovens that were here and their byproduct plants. The coke oven gas main we've talked about has hazards within it, and that spreads across the entire site. So just coming back to the residual, the risk assessment and the source pathway receptors. This is a very conceptual one just for a house. I've shown you how material can potentially be traveling into the river and how that can then become an issue. It gets stuck on the sediments as well, and those can be issues. Bear in mind the river is extensively dredged, so there is both the risk from the maintenance dredging, where possibly material is coming out continuously, that is then being picked up accidentally as part of the maintenance dredging. And then there is historical contamination, that when the capital dredging happened for the South Bank works after the crab die-off, that could still have been picking up a lot of historical material that was measured. Some of it was measured and was accepted, but there was material there because of this inhomogeneous nature. It isn't evenly spaced. You know, if I find there's no contamination here, I can't guarantee if I measure if there isn't any just near to it. And if you read the documents, there is that disclaimer. There are a couple of disclaimers in there that, you know, these data is only relevant for the space it was measured in, and even also for the time, because a lot of these rely on water concentrations. So bear in mind this is tidal. The water level in the site varies. So once again, that can vary what your contaminant measure level. So my strongly feel is that we should take account of what could be there rather than what we discover. Now, the outline conceptual map, you probably can't read this at scale. I mean, there'll be a link to where it is and you can find it in the documents. I think, you know, just to point out that actually an awful lot of these are grayed out. So here you have the sources. So this is a sort of diagram of what we've shown on those pictures. You have primary sources, you know, what's in the made ground, slag deposits and so on. You have secondary sources, sort of soil, what could be there. You have a way of it getting there, inhalation through indoor air, and that's commercial workers coming on the site when it's finished. You can get around that by basically protecting the ground. So this is where you put the capping on. And that is a path where they'll be mitigating. All these ones in light grey, which, for example, go to surface waters, go to the aquifers, and go to the sensitive ecological sites, such as the crabs in the river, all of those are greyed out. Because somewhere along this track here, the decision has been made that these are not significant risks. And, you know, for example, I'm very concerned that this doesn't take account of DNAPLs. I'm concerned that there are statements that the water under the site is brackish, yet there is also statements that say there is no connection to the river. Now, hang on a second, surely that has come in from the seawater that's made it brackish. And also the water goes up and down with the tides. So that doesn't feel like a relevant reason to say these are not real pathways. And there is a big, what I feel is a big assumption that dilution, because the river is huge, the sea is huge, we can put a bit more contamination in there and it will be diluted so it won't cause any damage. Now, certainly for things that, you know, are stuck to sediments, for example, that dilution may not happen very quickly. If things aren't soluble, they won't dissolve very rapidly, and lots of these toxic materials aren't. So I think, you know, those assumptions are ones that are critical to why the site might be unsafe. I think, you know, also this doesn't take any account of the risks created by the work going on the site, whether that's piling, explosives, or dredging activities. And then, you know, the sort of hydraulic continuity. So the base of the water is able to travel from under the site into the tidal flats, which is where we have sensitive, and into the river, where we have sensitive ecological issues. Now, for the site, I can show you what a real site conceptual map looks like. So this is what the developers submitted as part of their planning application. Now, you know, I don't know, this could be this is really one thing to notice is this is very clean. We have NAPL, as I've talked about, is sat here safely. You know, it's sat away from the river. Why is that the case? Well, there is some logic for it because the coke ovens weren't right by the river, but it does have a groundwater flow. So, you know, taking these grey arrows you had here, hang on a second, can we really put those as being grey? Because we've just admitted there is a contaminant source here. The fact we can't measure at the moment could be all sorts of reasons. So that's very nice and clean. You know, it's I think there probably is, let's see, big pockets, but there's material far closer to the river. This is all about risk to humans. It's not about the risk to the environment. It's not during construction when there should be extra holes in the ground here, which is when the highest risk to the environment. And I really don't like the way that the NAPLs have been shown localized entirely on their own over here. To spread it out, fine. I provocatively put this diagram together and I sent it around to a number of people who should know more about this than me. None of them said this was totally wrong. I can't find anybody who is able to come on the record because they all have conflicting interests. This site is a huge development, so most companies who have expertise in remediation of land are in some way involved in Teesworks, and so they rightly cannot comment on what's going on. So what I'm trying to show here is that actually, we've got material perhaps from the coke ovens recently came into the ground. It's been traveling through the ground. It's ended up underneath this sand lens. Over time, it seeped underneath the river, and now it's coming out here. So I'm trying to show with the red bits, this is the soluble material coming out of a DNAPL. So a dense non-aqueous phase liquid, coal tar. And this is the soluble material that in the end will cause the toxic damage. But that's all spreading through the ground. As I've said here, this is a combination of what I feel the Environment Agency's document on these materials and their fate in the ground and how they travelled, and what Arcadis, who were the consultants who put together the South Bank conceptual model. Now, it's rather different to the clean picture that we had before. I think it's more realistic. It's extreme, but without assuming this, and this is where we should have put together a impermeable barrier with monitoring here going on, to check that we weren't actually causing contamination, or we should have removed these sources. And that's, the other thing that needs to happen is removal of the large sources, so that over time, bioremediation and water flushing and so on could clean the ground. Okay, one of the other, this is actually, despite the fact this refers to Redcar South Bank, it actually comes out of the Net Zero Teesside planning applications, but it shows the process that's going on. I haven't really talked about the made ground very much. This is basically lumps of slag. So, I think of them as being sort of fist-sized or smaller lumps that are just together. So that's the ground made up. They built this up. It was all sand. They built it up with this made ground. So that's the slag lumps all together. In order to work on it, that is a very unstable ground, as you might imagine. You put a heavy weight in one place, things will move out of the way. So what they are doing is digging up to sort of 10 meters depth of material, and they're processing that. So if they're finding contamination there, that's being cleaned off, it's being crushed, and it's being placed back onto the ground. But, as this picture from their own work shows, you've got the material left in place. So this material hasn't been crushed, it hasn't been processed, it hasn't been cleaned. So what's to say that's not full of contamination? There have been some sampling done, but it doesn't have any cleaning going on here as shown. This ground is just left in place. Now, once again, we have a water path being shown here with this blue line, groundwater flow direction showing here. So my point is you have clean material replaced, but you have contaminated material left in place. So, that's where we are. The summary then is that basically, South Tees site was a contaminated site. Teesworks site will be a contaminated site. That doesn't mean to say it's unsafe, because you can still work on it. They put capping in place. It's not great, because if somebody starts to dig into it, they may discover big areas of contamination. I think there is also a risk that if, under certain conditions, some of the contamination that's left under the ground may well come up again. But in future, we have left a problem for future generations who will need to properly clean this site up. So is enough being done to protect the environment? I'm not convinced it is. The speed with which it's being done, the relatively low cost, suggests it hasn't. Measuring and monitoring should be based on known historical industry that's gone on there. Instead, what's happened is that measuring and monitoring has been used as a reason to stop looking for contamination just because you've found a low level. And that doesn't prove it isn't there, it just proves you haven't found it. if you've ever watched the detectorists, you will often see the bit where they are very close to something and they just miss it. And that's exactly the same here. We could have just missed that big lump of coal tar, those nasty hydrocarbons that are very toxic to the marine environment, because the sampling was done a metre away. And the concentrations look relatively low because the material isn't very soluble. And we don't know what its real concentration is, because if you remember that graph, it could be what we see as a relatively high concentration of something that's soluble but not very toxic. But the really toxic thing, which is left there, hasn't started to dissolve yet because the other material is dissolving first. So bearing in mind where we are now, I think it's really important that some of these environmental risk assessments are revisited. I mean, not by me, but by people who know about it and by a large enough set of people who haven't got a vested interest in having to deliver at speed on a project. They've got to be based on the cumulative, not individual risks. This is a huge site. There is a huge amount of work going on at relatively the same time. So these risks are cumulative. I mean, for example, Gary Caldwell is looking at the toxicity of materials we know are in the river. And if you look at them individually, it doesn't look too bad. As soon as you start to look at multiple materials, then you start to see there are huge levels of toxicity and things that are nominally below the individual risk level. So I think that's one issue, is we should look at multiple materials, but we also have to look at multiple areas, and we have to do the sum of the total amounts of materials being released, because we can't assume those are just going to be uniformly distributed, so they'll stay at that below level concentration. And equally, we can't assume that because that one material is below level concentration on its own, it won't, in combination with other materials, cause a toxic effect. The people who should do this are DEFRA, the Environment Agency, and CFAS, and we need to have a proper map of what the contamination is of the River Tees, because I've been talking just about South Tees, but the whole River Tees has been used for industry for a very long period. So in the sediment within it, there will be big risks as we start to do capital projects. Those are less of a risk for the ongoing maintenance dredging, because that's removing material that has been recently deposited, either from down the river, because we have big nutrient neutrality and wash off of land and farming land upstream, and peat even from off the moors that ends up in the River Tees, that then ends up as sediment, and we have big amounts of sand being driven into the river. So those need to be removed to keep the river clear. But whenever we carry out capital operations, these should really be carried out behind coffer dams to ensure that none of the historical contamination from all the multiple industries that have made Teesside very rich end up in the sea. The MMO methods are based on what's called OSPAR, the Oslo and Paris Convention, and they look at, once again, individual contamination levels per ton, for example. If you're putting 2 million tons of material at sea, we nearly need to think about what happens with that, not just the assumption that because 1 ton was okay at that concentration, 2 million tons will be. And then the councils potentially and other bodies involved in this who are responsible in naturing, English nature, and so on, can then look at what should be done to actually protect the environment. So thank you for listening to this. I'll put some links associated wherever you find this video, and you can find out more about it. And as I said, once again, I really acknowledge all the other people who've been looking into this. I mean, the site, unfortunately, despite in 2020 the government saying it was over to local control, that has not been democratic local control. It's been via the private happening, and there needn't necessarily be anything wrong with that. But I think at the moment there are severe issues that, from my point of view, the environment side, it really is being done far too quickly and far too cheaply. And when I was taught about quality as an ex-ICI employee, you were told you could have quality, you could have speed, or you could have cheap, but you couldn't have all three. You had to choose 2 of them. And something has got to be given here. And I think in this case, environmental quality is what gave. And instead, we have fast operations being done relatively cheaply, and the promise of large numbers of jobs, which does not justify and actually won't be helpful in the long term for the stability of those jobs or for the population who lives in the area. Thank you very much for listening.